Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Mr. Mackenzie's Distant Learning, titled Japanese Expansion 1933 to 1941. Now, if you see the time we're spanning here, this is obviously after the Manchurian crisis of 1931 and 32, but more specifically that it ends in 1941, and that is obviously a pretty big year. For those of you who know where we're going with this and have obviously studied a little bit of World War II history, we know that 1941 is a pivotal year for the Japanese and the Americans with the event of the Pearl Harbor bombings. So we're going to start again with a look at the map, like we usually do. And where we kind of left off last talk was the Japanese control of Manchuria. Okay, we should know where that is. That is really up in the northern area of Korea, really between the Russian southeastern frontier and north of Korea there. That is Manchuria. And now that the Japanese control it, it is now a puppet state of the Japanese with a puppet emperor, Puyi. It is no longer known as Manchuria, but from now it'll be known as Manchukuo. And that's when the Japanese are in control of that area. If we take a closer look at what was going on directly in China at this time, we'll see that it's not overly a very unified or economically prosperous time or politically prosperous time for Japan. Why is this? Why do you think in the 1930s this is not a really good time for Japan in Japan? Militarily, they're doing okay. I mean, they've expanded the territory. They've controlled all of Manchuria. It's become Manchukuo. But why in Japan are things having more political problems as well as economic? Well, if we know it's in the 1930s, so they're in the grips of a world economic depression, right? The Great Depression, and Japan is hit just like other nations. So they're in a competition. And there's also, when we're talking about the military, a competition now for government control. At this point, Japan's government is controlled by a civilian-based. Civilian members are elected and are now members of the government. But now we're going to see the competition competing for these spots within the government, for a more military control of the Japanese government. And this whole time period of the 1930s in Japan is called the Dark Valley. It's the term that's given to this time. So within Japan, there are two rival factions within the military. Two rival entities within the military that are at odds and are competing against each other for control of the Japanese government. The first group is known as the Kodoha, which means kind of the imperial way. The second group is called the Toseiha, which is more of a the control way. Now, the two of them both thought that the military should control the government. Okay, both military factions, both the Kodoha and the Toseiha, believe that they should be in control of the government. The military should be in control of the government. The Kodoha believe that they should attain it through more radical means, that they could use their military power to take over the government in what you might call a coup d'etat, a military takeover of the government. So they're looking for more kind of violent, radical means, while as the Toseiha think that they can get control of the government through more legal means, being appointed to positions, being voted in, that way. Another thing that you're going to want to remember is that the Kodoha believes that their number one target, their biggest adversary is the Soviet Union. They're the biggest threat to Japanese dominance in Asia. While as the Toseiha believe that their biggest threat and their biggest target is China. So keep that in mind as this story unfolds. In 1932, Japan gets yet another prime minister, Inukai Tsuyoshi. Hopefully I said that correctly. And yet again, we see another Japanese prime minister being assassinated, this time by a conspiracy between both naval and army officers. These officers will be put on trial, but ultimately, how is the public going to see this? Again, we go back to that indoctrination of the public having just such a high regard for the military, that they are revered in society, that it's going to be tough to keep them in check. So the outcome really is that the public offers full support for the military and the conspirators who organized this political assassination. In 1935, the leader of the Toshiha faction of the Japanese military is assassinated. At that moment, the Kodoha take it upon themselves to try and seize the moment, if you will. 1,500 Kodoha soldiers now march on the government in Tokyo. Remember, the Kodoha was the military faction that wanted to gain power through more violent military action than the Toshiha did. So now it seems that after they've assassinated the leader of the Toshiha, 1,500 Kodoha soldiers are now marching on the Japanese government in Tokyo. A coup d'etat is imminent. Unfortunately for them, the coup d'etat fails. Okay, the standing civilian government is there. They do have security forces. They have a military presence there. The Toshiha military troops are also there. Okay, the Kodoha were really just a faction of the Japanese military. And really, after this whole event, the Kodoha lose support for their kind of takeover, and the Toshiha begins to get more appreciation and support for themselves. In July of 1937, Tojo, whose picture you can't really see, this other picture was supposed to animate after. I guess I didn't hit the right buttons there. But behind this picture is General Tojo. He is a general of the Toshiha military group. In July of 1937, Tojo is going to be named Commander-in-Chief of the Kwangtung Army in Manchuria, which is now Manchukuo. Okay, we talked about the Kwangtung Army last lecture. They're the ones that are stationed in Manchuria, and that they kind of started that whole Mukden incident that started the Manchurian crisis. He is now the Commander-in-Chief of the Kwangtung Army in Manchukuo. Within weeks of this, Japan will begin what is known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. Okay, remember, this is the one. There's two wars between the Japanese and China. One that was in 1895, and the second one, which begins in 1937. Now, Japan is launching an attack now against China. They start air raids against more coastal cities, Chinese cities, which are close to the coast, like Beijing and Shanghai. A fairly short plane ride from Japan. Then they're going to start to move in further into mainland China. Now, it should be noted that Beijing and Shanghai are major metropolitan cities. They're not big kind of military bases. They're not big weapons factories or industrial areas. These are heavily civilian populated cities. So this is really foreshadowing of things to come and how World War II is going to be fought, that many civilians will be up close and witness the devastation of the destruction that World War II is going to bring them. So even though this is happening in 1937 and ultimately World War II in Europe is 1939, it's really foreshadowing how World War II is going to be fought, that there's going to be a mass civilian casualties throughout World War II. Now, as the Japanese are bombing the coastal cities of Beijing and Shanghai, the Chinese government is going to move more inland now. They're going to move the government from Beijing, I believe, to Nanking. So now Nanking will become the target of the Japanese military. It's also important to note that Nanking is really going to be remembered for the horrific atrocities that will be afflicted onto the Chinese civilians by the Japanese military. The raping of Nanking, as it comes to be known as, is where we see tens of thousands of Chinese civilians, men, women, children, old people, and young, will be raped and murdered at the hands of the Japanese military. Just a horrific moment in human history where the Japanese army really kind of dehumanized their enemy and just conducted horrific atrocities on the people, the civilians of Nanking. And as they kept coming forward, the Chinese government keeps moving locations of the base of their government, and the people within the city are kind of left defenseless. So they're kind of left defenseless to the onslaught of the Japanese military that is invading their home. So really, what's the overall goal here for the Japanese? Ultimately, with conducting such horrific atrocities, they're trying to break the will of the Chinese spirit. They're trying to break their spirit in hopes that China eventually surrenders. That's their ultimate goal, that Japan wants to break the backs, break the will and the spirit of the Chinese people. And then maybe then Japan can get China to sign some of those unequal treaties that Japan had suffered with other kind of Western powers. But ultimately what we see is that the Japanese greatly underestimate the Chinese nationalism. Not just the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek, but the overall sweeping nationalism of the country. Even though that they were conducting these just awful, horrific atrocities to the civilians of Nanking, that overall in China, their nationalism and spirit could not be broken. So strong was this spirit that the civil war that China was in the midst of between Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists and Mao Zedong and his communists, they're going to put a pause on that. They're going to stop their fighting so they can both focus on their common enemy now of this Japanese invasion. No more could the Japanese threat be left aside or to the frontier of Manchuria, but now it was in their homes. Now it was in their cities and streets. So they had to try and put their differences aside, put a pause on the Civil War to fight Japan. But the Civil War is going to kick back up again right after 1945. And really, ultimately, after all these just horrific moments that the Japanese soldiers are committing in Nanking, how do you go to the negotiation table after that? How does the Chinese government and Japanese government sit down together to try and talk out a peace treaty when one side doesn't look at the other as humans anymore? Any kind of negotiation is impossible to do. This war between Japan and China will ultimately continue until 1945. Spoiler alert, 2 bombs are going to be dropped on Japan by the United States in August of 1945, and Japan will surrender unconditionally. But until then, war will continue between Japan and China. And the further that Japan goes into China, the further they are away from resources and supplies. So they're really kind of vastly underestimating the will and nationalistic passions of the Chinese people, but they're also underestimating the sheer size of China and making a complete takeover almost impossible. If we backtrack a little bit now to about October of 1941, we have General Tojo named Prime Minister of Japan. You might remember Tojo. We talked about him a couple of slides back. You might have to go find a better Google image of him. He was hidden behind a picture. Actually, there he is right in the middle of these Japanese delegates. So if we look at our history now of our Japanese Prime Minister, one guy resigned, one guy was shot, and another guy was shot and killed. These were all kind of civilian elected men. At this point, something different has happened. Tojo is a military man. Tojo is a Toseiha general. So now for the first time, we have a military man in charge of the civilian government. So it looks like they've done it. Remember, the Toseiha wanted to do it by more legal means. And it looks like now they've done it through being appointed. Now, we also have to remember that other things are going on in the world. 1941 is a pretty big year. Okay, try and think about what is going on in Europe at this time, right? Nothing just happens in a bubble. We've been focusing quite a lot in the war between Japan and China, but other major events are occurring concurrently over in Europe. So let's think about this for a second, okay? We're in October of 1941. What is going on in Europe at this time, and how does this benefit Japan? I want you to think about that for a couple of moments, okay? Maybe pause the video and write down a couple of ideas of what you think. We've studied World War II a little bit, probably in grade 10, in last semester. What is going on in Europe at this time, okay? By almost towards the fall of 1941. And how does this benefit Japan? So take a few moments and jot down some ideas. Okay, so what is going on in Europe at this time? Well, let's think about this, okay? We have Germany in 1939 has invaded Poland. And then at the same time, on the other side, the Soviet Union invades Poland as well. Then Germany really takes its aim on Western Europe. By 1940, France has surrendered. France is out of this war by 1940. So France is pretty much occupied by Germany. In fact, France is divided at this point. In the northern half of France is occupied by Nazi Germany, under Nazi Germany control. In the south, we get this puppet regime known as Vichy France, controlled by the Nazis as well. So it's like the idea of like kind of Manchu Kuo is this puppet regime for Japan. Vichy France is now a puppet government for Germany. Now, how does this benefit Japan? Well, we have to think about all of that land that France controlled in Asia. Their sphere of influence. What do they control in Asia and Southeast Asia and in areas known as French Indochina? Are areas of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. What's going to happen with all of those land holdings? Now, this could benefit Japan because now, if they are on board with the Axis powers of Germany and Italy, maybe they can go out and take French land holdings in Indochina and Asia. So this is exactly what happens. Italy is going to sign a pact with Germany and Italy. And that's going to be known as the Tripartite Pact. Tripartite, three-party pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan. This is also known as the Axis Pact. Before Japan signs on, it was just Italy and Germany. They were the Axis powers. Okay, if we think about the idea that the world spins on an axis, right? The whole world, in at least Europe, revolves around this Axis power of Italy and Germany, right? Italy revolves around, Europe revolves around that axis between Germany and Italy. And now I suppose with Japan being on board with the Tripartite Pact, the world really revolves around these Axis powers. So why do they sign it? What's in it for Germany and Italy? What is it good for them for? Okay, why is this a good thing for Germany and Italy to have Japan on their side with this Tripartite Pact? Okay, go ahead and pause the video. Try and come up with answers on your own, and we'll see how you did. Okay, so why is this good for Germany and Italy? Well, ultimately, Hitler is playing the long game here. Hitler knows that a war with the Soviet Union is going to happen. The Soviet Union might not know that. Joseph Stalin might not know that. In fact, he was pretty unprepared for it. But Hitler knows that a war against the Soviet Union is eventually going to happen, okay? And having Japan on their side would be very beneficial, because if we think on the Soviet Union or Russia's eastern frontier pretty much borders Japan now. Manchukuo, the former Manchuria, now controlled by Japan. So once Hitler and Germany invades into the Soviet Union, the hope is that Japan would also declare war on the Soviet Union. Then all of a sudden you would see the Soviet Union now in a war on two fronts, the same way Germany found itself in a war on two fronts during World War I. Okay? I mean, Hitler's really just using who and what he needs for his end goal. He has no real kind of love or empathy or sympathy for the Japanese people and their cause. He's going to use them for his end goal to crush communism and to crush the Soviet Union. So now we got to ask ourselves, what's in it for Japan? Why are they signing on for the Tripartite Pact? Well, we kind of mentioned the scenario a few slides ago with all of the French holdings in Southeast Asia. All of those are promised now to Japan. Okay, Japan is promised the Asian colonies controlled by the Allies. Okay, bigger sphere of influence now, more control in Asia for Japan. So April 1941, Japan is going to sign a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. Now, why are they doing this? Okay, why do this? Well, if we think about it, Hitler did the same thing. In 1938, Hitler signs a pact of non-aggression with the Soviet Union, kind of holding off for his imminent or eventual invasion of the Soviet Union. So the Japanese are kind of doing the same as well. And then once having this neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, you don't really need to station all of your troops in the north. You don't need to have all your army men up in the northern frontier, or these northern provinces of China and close to Russia. You got to focus your battle now. That's where Japan wants to be, focusing the battle more mainland China, right? They're going in now to Nanking and pushing in further. And ultimately, the Soviet Union is very happy to sign this. They are very busy in Europe at this time. Okay, this is signed in April of 1941. Hitler hasn't invaded the Soviet Union yet, but if we look at what's been going on since 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Soviet Union also invaded Poland. And then once that was done, they looked on to Estonia and Latvia, and Lithuania. And then they're eventually going to have what's known as the Winter War against Finland. So the Soviet Union has its hands full in Europe right now. So So signing this neutrality pact allows Stalin some breathing room. He's not going to have a war on two fronts with what's going on in the West against the Balkans, the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, and then their war against Finland, and then having to worry about the Japanese in the East as well. And now Japan doesn't have to keep its troops up in the north either. So Japan begins to move troops into Southeast Asia, where the French holdings were, like Indochina. And they're going to even move closer to now more American interests in colonies like the Philippines. So this is going to get the Americans a little anxious of what's going on now too. You can tell that things are building up to something now, right? Let's take a look at our calendar here. We're in April of 1941. All of this is going to come to a head by December of 1941. So, what is the result of all of this? Now we're seeing some pretty aggressive moves by Japan on French holdings in Indochina, as well as American interests now in Southeast Asia and the Philippines. So what's the response? What's America going to do? So in 1941, the U.S. will freeze, put a hold on any kind of money or assets that Japanese businesses have in American banks. So if the Japanese have money in American banks, or if the Japanese have money and assets in American businesses, America now puts a freeze on that, meaning the Japanese cannot touch it, they cannot withdraw, they can't get their money. The U.S. will also place an embargo on Japan, basically cutting them off from resources they need to supply their war machine. Cuts off Japan from its much needed oil and steel shipment from the United States. If we look at this political cartoon here, again we see our Japanese military figure here with their kind of tiny tank, and it says it says Jap war machine. So the term Jap is a derogatory racist term. Please do not use that in any paper one that you write, or any paper at all. It is a derogatory term. Do not refer to the Japanese people as Japs. But American propaganda will refer to the Japanese as Japs quite a bit. Even the way that they're portrayed, if you take a close look at the face, the Americans get very racist in their propaganda against the Japanese, dehumanizing them, not even making them look human anymore, more animalistic in their propaganda. But the message here is that once Uncle Sam here kind of puts a kink in the supply line, the Japanese war machine is kind of halted. It's almost rendered useless. So this act by the Americans, putting an embargo on their oil and steel shipments that they need for their war machine, was basically seen as an act of war. At that point, war against the Americans was imminent. It was going to happen. So while all of this is going on, while the U.S. has put embargoes on their shipment of oil and steel to the Japanese, we do see kind of Japanese delegates and American delegates trying to negotiate terms. But while this whole thing is going on, the Japanese Army and Navy are putting together attack plans against the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on the island of Oahu. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launch a surprise attack, simultaneously also attacking Hong Kong and the Philippines. The next day, December 8th, 1941, the United States almost unanimously Congress almost unanimously agrees to go to war. I think one congressperson decides not to, doesn't agree to the war. I think that congressperson was a pacifist, but Nevertheless, the day after the attack, the United States declares war on Japan. World War II has now begun in Asia. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which begins in 1937, has now merged with the Second World War. Now, to talk about kind of the Battle of Pearl Harbor, maybe you studied that a little bit last year. It does hurt the American Navy, but ultimately a few things do save them. Many of their battleships were destroyed, but as luck would have it, all of the aircraft carriers were out of the harbor that day. And the aircraft carrier is going to be the life force of how World War II is going to be fought. Those aircraft carriers are going to be very important for the success in the war in the Pacific. The Japanese will use them too. It is very hard to fly from Japan all the way to Hawaii. So they're going to need those aircraft carriers. The same thing's going to happen when the United States use their island hopping campaign in the Pacific as well. Most of the battleships are damaged, but the aircraft carriers were out that day, and they're going to be the lifeblood of the Second World War and the Battle of the Sea. Okay, I think that's it. Okay, so a shorter one today, but World War II has now merged into the Pacific, and now we're going to see in our next episode what is the international response to all of this. Obviously, we have to see what the League of Nations is going to be saying to all of this. What is the Americans' response to this? Yes, it is going to be a declaration of war, as well as other Western nations like the British and the French. So there you go. Episode 2 in the books. Congratulations for making it through another one. Stay safe, and that's it for me. Bye-bye.